legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com. And today I'd like to say a little word about the war on pubs. Now, pub is literally short for public house. That house that is open to the public, unlike probably the one that you and indeed I live in, which is not generally open to the public. Now, pubs as drinking establishments, as I'm thinking of them, are unique to Britain and Ireland as well, is after all the British Isles. And there are, of course, drinking establishments of all sorts all over the world. But in terms of society and culture, what I'm really thinking about today is the traditional British pub as a social space. These things have been called ale houses, taverns, inns, all sorts of things down the century, sometimes offering accommodation, sometimes not. But aside from these basic functions, food, drink, somewhere to stay, their core function really has been as meeting places. It was in the 17th century in Britain where the pub as it is today began to really take shape, and then you would be into the 19th century before a lot of the conventions that we recognise in pubs, how the rooms are divided up and the bar to stand at and how drinks are stored and served, and a lot of the things that went on in pubs in those days. Many drinkers in the 20th and indeed early 21st century would recognise those conventions as having survived since that time. Now, there were, of course, drinking establishments in Britain going back at least to Roman times, so that's the best part of 2,000 years. When the Romans departed Britain, when Roman rule came to an end and you were into the Anglo-Saxon period, as I say, that's when these ale houses, or whatever they called them at the time, really began to function as social centres. They were a centre for civil discourse, where you could discuss the important matters of the day, in society and politics, and who was who and who was doing what and what events were occurring and what do you think of that and what should be done about that. And very importantly, in my mind, in the Anglo-Saxon period, these establishments became centres where one could seek mutual aid, mutual cooperation, mutual collaboration, literally reach out to other members of your society in a safe and convivial space. And these last few points are really worth bearing in mind as we go forward with this. Now, in Britain in particular, and as I say also in Ireland, let's just say the British Isles, we'll stick with that. You have particularly distinct characteristics for the town pub and also the country pub. And whether you're British, Irish, or wherever you are in the world, if you've ever experienced or thought about British pubs, you may have experienced one or both of these and have particular ideas about them. And they have very distinct characteristics, whether you prefer one over the other or not. The key about them being within their particular community, whether it is within a village or within a town, these were central to the social fabric, and they have been, say, for many centuries. That has been changing for a while, and it's changing very rapidly now, which is kind of the whole point that I'm trying to get across. In the village in particular, in the British Isles, villages quite often have just one pub, and that was so important, as I say, as a social hub. And so many of those have disappeared, along with other amenities in villages, as a result partly of urbanization and pressure dragging people, or pushing people rather, towards cities. They've been left bereft of that social centre. And once that's gone, really a lot of other parts of threads of the social fabric are lost as well. In wider British culture, particularly in literature, the pub has played such an important part down the centuries. So many great British novels and plays and poems and whatnot make reference to pubs, inns and taverns, and so many of the great writers, thinkers, philosophers, people who contributed so much to what British Isles, the different cultures that make it up, have been, have lived part of their life experience through the lens of the pub, the tavern, the inn, the hostelry. So it really is a thread, a common thread that runs right through, as I say, the fabric of not just society, but also wider culture. The decline in the number of pubs in Britain really began in the early 80s, and there were a number of reasons for this. Culture in itself was changing. We know how different the 80s was in many ways to the previous decades, or the previous post-war decades anyway. And there were all sorts of changes that affected pub closures, or indeed, preventing new pubs from opening. One thing was the retailing of alcohol becoming more and more widespread, alcohol becoming more available, more choice, more affordable imported beers, wines and spirits. And we have what we call here in Britain the off license, which was a shop that was opened to sell mostly just alcohol. The word license in that comes from the alcohol license, which pubs have to have as well. So it's directly related to that. They call them bottle shops in Australia, and I think some other parts of the world as well. And so drinking at home became more of a thing during the 80s, not significant enough to really impact pub closures, but the pubs themselves began to respond to other changes in culture. And you had during the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s, the so-called gastropub, and this was serving food in pubs, which had never really been a big part of pub culture, unless the pub happened to offer accommodation as well. But that began to change, and so pubs found themselves in competition with restaurants and other entertainments for a night out, and so that changed the function of the pub, because if you go to a pub for a meal, you're not likely to be mixing with a lot of strangers, talking with a lot of people, or talking very much really at all. You're going there for a meal. And entertainment culture, electronic entertainment culture, became more prevalent during the 80s as well. More TV channels, more TVs, full stop, and then TVs started to appear in pubs in a way that they hadn't before. There was always entertainment in pubs in terms of games, board games, darts, what have you, cards, but none of that was just a sideshow really. It didn't detract from the central function of the pub as a social space. And there were demographic changes that began to happen. Of course, each new young generation comes along, and they quite often want something significantly, if not radically, different from their parents and grandparents. What they wanted from social life. So that undoubtedly had an effect. But despite those changes, I didn't notice a huge change in pub culture, apart from some gentrification. But I didn't notice a huge difference during the 80s and the 90s. I think the first big event that I would say really, if not in and of itself, altered pub culture, but really exacerbated other changes that were perhaps already in motion, was the smoking ban Now, smoking bans in pubs and restaurants and other public spaces are very common now all around the world. But in the British Isles, the first one to be implemented was in Ireland in 2004, the Irish Republic, I should say, as opposed to Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And it was predicted that that would have a significant effect, and it certainly did. It's not that people didn't want to go to the pub anymore, but it's just that, like it or not, smoking tobacco was also a centuries, if not millennia old part of social culture. And mostly men, because it was mostly men who went to pubs for the longest time, also smoked tobacco in pubs. And yet, cigarette consumption may have been on a decline anyway, but bottom line was that banning smoking in pubs definitely changed that culture. A lot of the people type of person that you'd have seen there just no longer went there. And I was very conflicted about the ban, because on the one hand, I've never smoked. I don't like the smell of tobacco smoke unless it's a pipe. And I don't like being saturated in too much tobacco smoke. For a non-smoker, it's not pleasant. However, I'm instinctively against banning things. I just don't like the idea of just one group of people saying to usually a larger group of people, thou shalt not do this any longer. So on balance, for someone like me, it probably had a superficial, or at least temporary, net benefit in that you come away from the pub and your clothes and your hair didn't smell of tobacco smoke. But in the long run, I'm not so sure. There's an organisation in Britain called the Campaign for Real Ale, or CAMRA for short, CAMRA, and they were at the forefront of a number of campaigns, obviously, for real ale, but yet to preserve the traditions and values and qualities of traditional pubs. And they had been engaged in campaigning, obviously, for a long time, but campaigns in general, not just by CAMRA, stepped up a notch, I think, after the smoking ban, which incidentally came into place in the United Kingdom in 2007, just 3 years after the one in Ireland. And these campaigns have assumed increasing relevance because even from when that decline first began in the early 80s, the pub scene was losing dozens of establishments every week. Perhaps not every single week of every calendar year, but averaging out, those were the sort of closures you were looking at. And competition from other attractions, ways of spending time, drinking at home, going to clubs, going to restaurants, going to the cinema, doesn't fully account for that, in my mind. And it was around the time of the smoking ban that this phrase, the war on pubs, came into my head, because it started to look to me, as a long-time social observer, that if there wasn't something concerted going on here, then that's what it looked like. That's what it appeared to be. In totality, that's what it looked like. One could say, well, there's these various components of what's happening make up the whole picture, and they're not directly related. That's fine, but as I say, when it all shakes out, it looked like forces were attempting to alter social fabric by altering the way that people interacted. And CAMRA have estimated that as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, that in the UK we could lose 10,000 pubs. Now they're basing that, I guess, on what's happened so far with pub closures, temporary and permanent, and projected figures based on that, but projected into what future, I'm not quite sure, because nobody knows how long this is going to go on for. We're already now in January 2021, and all of this carnage began back in March last year, in this country anyway. And the way things are looking at the minute with what the noises the government are making, Will we see pubs allowed to operate again normally before March this year? That'll be almost 1 full year of this. We're going to have to wait and see. But again, if I was a pub owner, I mean, how do you make any plans for anything? And certainly, if I was one of those campaigners of CAMRA or any other organisation, I'd be very concerned about where this is heading. I think, unlike all the previous changes, demographic or otherwise, that have affected pub closures, with the COVID restrictions, the most insidious thing, outside of outright closure, where the periods of time when pubs have just not been allowed to open at all, the most insidious thing has been the social distancing measures in terms of how that has affected how people interact in these spaces. People having to arrange a time to visit the pub, to book a table. You can't just turn up and go in and choose a table. You have to arrange a time. You have to arrange a table. There may not be one available. Some of the restrictions have meant that and the ones that were running in the UK until recently meant you had to have a quote unquote substantial meal with your drink. So you couldn't just go in to drink. That further cut down the number of people who wanted to go there. When you've been in these spaces, which I haven't been actually since all this happened, I've felt very uneasy about the possibility of doing it. You've got tables set very far apart, sometimes with plastic screens in between them, so you might as well not even be in the same space as other people. If you want to have a conversation with people at another table, people you haven't met, not only is that strongly discouraged, not just by the regulations and the plastic screens, but you're having to shout at them across the room. Shouldn't be doing any of that. Don't raise your voice. For the same reason that there's no singing in pubs, no spontaneity of other kinds because of droplet spray and other such things. You can no longer stand at the bar. You can't even order at the bar. It's table service only. Now, lots of European listeners will be saying, oh, that's fine. And I've certainly been to Italy and Germany and Scandinavian countries many times and enjoyed the fact that I could go in, sit at a table, and some waiting staff would come across, ask us what we would like. They brought it to us and we settle the bill when we leave. That's fine. That's what you're signing up for. That's the experience that you're expecting to get. But it's very different when you've been used to freely moving around. And incidentally, with these rules in the UK pubs, you can't even get up and go to the bathroom, basically, unannounced. You've got to seek permission. And God forbid that you speak to anyone on your way there, on the way back. Can't do any of that. So the table service thing is fine, but it completely robs the whole situation of any fluidity, any spontaneity, any of that just choice randomness that more or less unregulated public spaces have always been about. A lot of those dimensions of it are the reasons why people get together socially in the first place, to meet people they don't know, talk to people they haven't spoken to before, learn new things, discuss new things, have new experiences, whatever it happens to be. And it's all fine and dandy to say that this is all temporary, but a lot of the damage that's been done, particularly in terms of business closures, will not be easily undone, if at all, after this. And one of the things I want people to ponder on this occasion, as I've asked people to do in other videos where I've talked about other dimensions of COVID restrictions and how they affect our social interactions, is think about how this will affect people's future behaviour. If people are already scared of shaking hands or hugging someone, or taking would you like a peanut from my bag of peanuts? I can't do that. Oh my God. If it's at that level of fear and trepidation, how long will it take for that to normalize itself again, or will that ever happen? And what do those little tiny, seemingly insignificant social interactions, what do they really mean in the wider picture? I think they're incredibly important. And I think those of us who've not really thought about it we're going to discover how important they are, or important they were, in the months and years to come. Now, all of this brings us to the image of this magazine, which you will have seen on the thumbnail for this video. This is the latest issue of Wetherspoon News, what seems to be a quarterly magazine published by the Wetherspoon pub chain here in the UK. Now, Wetherspoons are not everyone's idea of a good night out in the pub. They're always put into historic buildings, so architecturally they're very interesting. But that's nothing to do with the pub chain. But many of us, including myself, feel that they serve fairly bland beer, fairly bland food. Everything about it is fairly controlled and predictable for an audience who want that sort of experience. The reason I'm mentioning them, and this magazine of theirs, is entirely related to the company's response to the COVID restrictions. Now, as you can see, just in case you didn't get it first time, you see on the cover here, this cast of characters are British politicians. And I don't know if you can read the headline there, the headlines on the front cover, but the company, and particularly the company boss, Tim Martin, are extremely skeptical, extremely angry about the way the government have been handling the hospitality sector in general, and the pub scene in particular in this country. Now, Wetherspoons started out in 1979, founded by Tim Martin, and they currently run around about 900, mostly pubs, but some hotels in the UK. And Tim Martin is particularly controversial and despised amongst the political and cultural mainstream, the sort of the more left-leaning in this country, London-centric, because he was a supporter of Brexit. Britain's exit from the EU. In fact, he was quite what's the word? He gloated about it and was, waving his hands in the air with joy, really, when it happened, and said how good it was going to be. So you can see why he's despised by so many people. Now, it doesn't matter what you think about Brexit. That's not the point. I'm just painting a picture of this character and how the establishment view him. I must say, he's been highly outspoken about the COVID measures, the effect on his business. And again, it doesn't matter what you necessarily think about how he's conducted himself throughout this. The reason I mention it is because he's a very high-profile businessman in the pub sector, very well established, very independent, and he's put his money where his mouth is with this publicity campaign. This magazine, he said, was going to be available, it's free by the way, of course, on every table in every Wetherspoons pub, as it always is, by the way. Now, I got hold of a copy simply by, I didn't even have to go into a Wetherspoons pub. I just walked up to the door, and a member of staff greeted me, of course, because you can no longer just walk in. I asked about the magazine, and they said how many copies would I like. So I was obviously very keen for this to get out and about. Now, the wider point here, really, and where all this is going, is the effect that this has, or what the changes in pub culture say about the future of public spaces, public gatherings, public meetings, where people from wherever, whether invited or uninvited, can discuss the matters of the day, face to face, one-on-one, in groups, unplanned, randomly uncontrolled, whatever, or controlled and with a set agenda, whatever it happens to be. It's about free association, the right to assemble. This is also related to the right to protest. And one of the main fallouts so far in all of this, the COVID restrictions, has been that clampdown on freedom of association and freedom to meet. Right down to not being able to meet members of your own family, never mind random strangers who you now cannot approach because they'll run away from you, can't shake their hand, can't hug them, You can't even have an argument with them because you just don't get to speak to them in the same way. So my worry is that another very important arena for social discourse is being taken away. And for me, it's about pubs because although I'm not an avid pub goer, from when I first started going to pubs in the early 90s through to the present day, the sort that I've always preferred above all has been the sort I've been talking about all the way through this. Places where you go to meet, talk, discuss, not to be blasted with loud music, not to watch football game. There's establishments that do that if you want to do that, but places that uphold the tradition of what the public house has always been about. And of course, the trend today is towards doing everything online and virtually. And the main problem with that in the tradition of history of these ways of doing things that I'm talking about is that it's all monitored. It doesn't mean there are people watching your every move, but the systems that facilitate online activity automatically monitor, record everything, document it, sometimes police it. So these things are in no way a substitute for meeting in person. And my concern is that if we start to move all our social interactions online, we're automatically going to be more inhibited, because even if we're not being overtly monitored or controlled, the fact that we know that we're really not alone, despite being utterly alone, but really we're not alone, the electric eye is there, that is going to change our behavior. And we see that online already. And my concern is that we're going to see that massively going forward. We've seen the same effect on other public arenas, churches, for example, sports, live entertainment. All of these things affected in the same way. I mean, with live entertainment and sports, these things can't even take place in any meaningful way online. Again, watching a football game with nobody in the stadium or watching a band play across Zoom is not the same in any size, shape or form as actually being there. I mentioned in one of my other videos about the energy of the shared space, actually being in the same room, the electricity, the energy that moves beyond your body, and is the thing that we pick up on when we're around other people, good, bad and indifferent. That energy is what we sense. And it's through those conduits that all the joy and all the spontaneity of social interactions occur. And that's what social gatherings like the pub are at their best. Just the unexpected happening, good or bad, and just meeting someone you've never met before, trying something to eat or drink you've never had before, just your life, the number of people whose lives have turned corners that they never expected, vistas of opportunity that have opened because of these random chance meetings. Can this happen online? Maybe. But if we continue to be increasingly atomized and isolated in our own little pockets of tech, then this is going to, undoubtedly it already is, but it's going to continue to alter for the worst, in my opinion, the social fabric, just the threads that keep us all hanging together. And as I said earlier, this has already happened in the early 21st century in the internet age. These changes are well documented. I've done many shows on legalizefreedom.com addressing these topics. I see the potential now for this negative effects to be aggravated hugely going forward. And that's what concerns me particularly. So I just leave you with the thought that what this is really about is the value of and the already happening and potentially worsening loss of free association, free thought, freedom from control. And that's what the traditional pub, in my mind, full of beer swilling and smoke and laughter, and carousing and jokes and opinions and arguments and bust-ups and make-ups and free association are really about all of those things. It's about being human. You know, the pub is like a human society, a traditional human society in a microcosm. And there is no substitute for human interaction, human contact. It doesn't mean that every altered form of this or every new way we might find to interact online or elsewhere is without value or interest or might add something. Technology has added a lot to our human experience, but it's in danger of, I believe, doing more harm than good. And whether we choose to go down the techno route or not in terms of our future social interactions, we may find that through choice, even if it's enforced choice or whether it's subconscious, we don't realize we're choosing it, that we may avoid the sort of human contact that I've been talking about because we've become more afraid of it than we are aware of the joy of it. So until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com